Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Nancy Soreng, President of the League of Women Voters of Maryland, and it's our pleasure to welcome you to the General Election Candidate Forum for Attorney General. Instead of a traditional format, we are recording interviews with each of the candidates, and these interviews will be posted to the University of Baltimore School of Public Affairs YouTube channel. In addition, you will find recordings of forums that we sponsored for the candidates for Comptroller and Governor. The forum is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Maryland, the Schaefer Center for Public Policy at the University of Baltimore, Maryland Nonprofits, MarylandReporter.com, Maryland Matters, and Maryland Latinos United. To learn more about the upcoming election, the candidates, and important statewide and local ballot questions, please check out vote411.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce your moderator for this interview, Len Lazarick, founding editor and publisher of Maryland Reporter.
Folks, the candidates for Attorney General are being interviewed separately. They're both going to be asked the same questions, but obviously there is no chance for rebuttal. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement. The questions were prepared by the forum committee, and they'll have 2 minutes to answer the question. And there'll be a 3-minute closing statement. Nancy Soreng, who you just saw, is the timekeeper. She's the president of the League of Women Voters. The time allotted for each portion of the program will appear on the screen and count down as time elapses. The screen will turn yellow when 15 minutes remain. It will turn red, and the word stop will appear when the time is up. Candidates may finish their sentence, but they must stop speaking. So, Congressman, keeping me honest.
Thank you, Len. I want to thank the League of Women Voters and all of tonight's or today's sponsors for this candidate forum. Important to bring information to the voters about the candidates, their values, their background, their experience, and their commitment and interest in running. I have nearly 3 decades as an attorney and also experiences ranging from a colonel in the United States Army to a 3-term member of the United States Congress, having spent also 8 years in the General Assembly and Lieutenant Governor, 8 years in Annapolis. And I know through those experiences that Marylanders deserve and they want an Attorney General who'll be a champion for change, someone who understands that you just can't do the same old and get better results. I'm running for Attorney General because I know that barriers exist in Maryland. We see it in healthcare and housing. We see it in the economy and the environment. We see it in the workplace, policing, and the criminal justice system. So I'm running for Attorney General to dismantle those barriers, to make government work again, and to fight for the changes that will protect every person and empower every community. As the Attorney General, I'm the chief legal officer of the state. And while I represent the state, I work for the people. And as such, I'll investigate issues and problems. I'll advocate for legislative and other change, and I'll set enforcement priorities that are consistent with the people who elect me. So whether we're taking on the rise in crime or improving public safety, addressing climate change or environmental justice, dealing with affordable housing or quality healthcare issues, or defending against attacks on women's reproductive freedoms, whether we're protecting consumers or veterans or seniors, immigrants and refugees, or even voting rights and workers' rights, or the rights of the LGBTQIA+ community. And even when we're holding public officials, all public officials, including law enforcement, accountable, as Attorney General, I'll work for the people, I'll fight for the people, and I'll fight for justice.
So, why don't you explain for the folks, what are the key functions of the Attorney General's office?
Sure. And Len, that could take the entire 30 minutes we have, because think of the Attorney General's office.
Yeah, but you only have 2 minutes now.
The Attorney General's office is like the largest law firm in the state of Maryland. A lot of people think about the public safety function. There is a criminal division. It addresses things like organized crime, narcotics trafficking, and gun trafficking, and labor trafficking, environmental crimes, and Medicaid fraud. It also has a civil division where it affirmatively investigates and takes enforcement actions. Think about the opioid settlement. And it also defends state government in federal court and state court and in administrative proceedings. We have an antitrust division and a consumer protection division that do just that, protect consumers and ensure that our economy is competitive. We also represent every state agency, the Department of the Environment. We're involved in environmental enforcement actions against those who are polluting and violating their permits for discharges into the air or the water. We represent the state in contracting, procurement. We advise every agency before they put out an RFP, request for proposal, and before they sign the contract. We represent every agency from the Department of Health and all of the local health departments, the Department of Social Services, and all of the social service departments around the state. But I think we represent the governor in actions that the governor takes in promoting the interests of the state, and we advise the Maryland General Assembly. So as you can see, it's a diverse law firm with a varied practice, about 550 attorneys, plus or minus, 700 total employees, that's support staff with investigators and counselors. So it's a diverse function, but the important thing to remember, we represent the state, but we work for the people of Maryland.
Given that you cover a lot of bases, what are your priorities as you go into office?
And my priorities really I set based on not only the 22, 24, almost 24 years of experience I have as an elected public official, but even more recently, just on the campaign trail, listening to voters across the state and what they expect of the Attorney General and the concerns that they have. Today, and more so than ever before in any of the elections I've been involved with, it seems as if crime and public safety ranks number one on people's concerns. There are other issues like the rise in prices and inflation. But when they think about the Attorney General, it's like, what are you going to do to make our neighborhood safer? So the Attorney General does a number of things. One is we partner with state's attorneys, because state's attorneys in the 24 counties in the city of Baltimore, they do 95% of the crime fighting, the violent crime. But in the Office of the Attorney General, we have an organized crime unit. We can partner with state's attorneys, also with the U.S. Attorney and federal partners to help in the crime fighting effort. But more than just investigating and prosecuting crime, which is an important part of keeping our neighborhoods safe, we also have to reform our criminal justice system and our juvenile justice system. You know, Len, Maryland, regrettably, we incarcerate a higher percentage of Black men ages 18 to 24 than any other state in the nation. We have a higher percentage of Black and brown men behind bars in our local jails and our state prisons than any other state in our nation. So as the Attorney General, I'm also going to be advocating for reform in the criminal justice system, reform in the juvenile justice system, like more mental health and drug and alcohol substance abuse treatment and counseling services, more educational services and wraparound services for our children who are in the juvenile justice system. So yes, we're going to investigate and prosecute, but we're also going to reform the system so we can reduce recidivism and divert people to more productive treatment.
Good, thanks. What makes you uniquely qualified to become Attorney General?
You know, I don't know if I could say, or that any candidate can say they're uniquely qualified, but what I can say is that I bring a broad set of experiences that are suitable for the Office of the Attorney General. Again, going back to the first question, think of the Office of the Attorney General. It's a large, diverse office. So what you need is someone who can manage people and who can be an inspirational and visionary leader. Because we've got 700 people in that office that are doing big things on behalf of Maryland. They're professional, they're competent, they're committed, and they want to do right by the people of Maryland. So as the Attorney General, I need to ensure that they've got the resources, the training, right? The skills to do their job and to do it well. In my experience, both executive experience as lieutenant governor, I've got executive experience in the United States Army where I was a colonel leading an 80-member unit of military lawyers and paralegals. So you need a manager and a leader who's going to make sure they have the resources and the environment and the motivation to do the big things they're doing on behalf of Maryland. Someone who has relationships with the General Assembly, because it's the General Assembly that appropriates the dollars and extends the authority to the office to do the big things like civil rights enforcement, like environmental compliance enforcement. So you need someone with the relationships with the General Assembly and someone who has a relationship with the other executive departments in government. As Lieutenant Governor, having served on the second floor with a governor, I know how government works. And again, government is our client. It's our principal client. Although we work for the people, we represent the state. And one of the things I know about good attorneys, the best attorneys know their clients. And I may not be the best attorney general in history. Who knows? We'll see how history writes that one. But I certainly know the client, and that's the state. So those are some of the experiences and backgrounds that I'll bring to the office.
Thanks. Legislation passed in 2021 requires local law enforcement to refer all cases of fatalities involving police officers to the Attorney General's office for investigation. And this year, the Office of Attorney General testified in favor of amending the law to allow the Attorney General's office to prosecute these cases if the state's attorney declines to do so. Do you agree with that proposal?
Yeah, and it doesn't take 2 minutes to answer that one. I do agree with that proposal. And look, when you speak with most prosecutors, and I know in Maryland, the state's attorneys did not support extending to the Attorney General the authority to investigate police-involved deaths. I understand that. But if you speak with most states' attorneys or prosecutors, they will tell you they would prefer to conduct their own investigation on the cases that they are going to prosecute, because the manner that in which you investigate a crime often shapes how you're going to prosecute or present that crime and the evidence to the jury, or in some cases, although not to the jury. So I do believe that the logical next step is to provide the Attorney General with the authority to prosecute those cases if during the course of the investigation, probable cause exists to be able to proceed with a prosecution. Now, I think that the local state's attorney should have the right of first refusal to take that case. There's some state's attorneys who may not want to take the case. There may be some state's attorneys in a very complex case that may not have the resources to take that case. And when that happens, I think the Attorney General should be able to proceed with the prosecution again, provided that there's sufficient basis in which to prosecute police officers. So I will support that extension of the law that was passed, I think now 2 years ago, so that the Attorney General's office can prosecute those cases, those police officers, where after an investigation, a thorough, complete investigation shows that a prosecution is warranted for misconduct that resulted in the death of a Marylander or a citizen.
You've already talked about the Attorney General's office is the largest law firm. Do you have any ideas for reorganizing the office in any way?
You know, let me just say that as a general matter, and I've assumed responsibilities and leadership for a number of organizations during the course of my career, and I find the prudent thing is to transition to an office to observe how it functions, how it operates, how it's organized, and make a determination whether it's as effective as certainly in this case the people of Maryland deserve. So I don't go in with any preconceived notions that there is any reorganization or restructure that needs to take place. I do believe there are some areas where the office needs additional resources and additional authorities. I think I mentioned earlier civil rights enforcement. Today in the Office of the Attorney General, there is a civil rights division. We work with the Maryland Civil Rights Commission because many civil rights actions are brought to the Civil Rights Commission, but we don't have independent enforcement authority. I want to seek that authority. I want to get that authority from the General Assembly. So when there is discrimination, okay, when there are violations of a Marylander's civil rights, the Attorney General's office can bring that case in a court of law. We don't want to undermine or circumvent the Maryland Civil Rights Commission, the EEOC, but I do believe it's an authority, a responsibility that the Attorney General should have. I also would like to seek the independent authority to bring enforcement actions for environmental violations. Today, there is an environmental crimes unit, and that's usually for things like unlawful discharges or dumping. But often there are violations short of criminal conduct that could result in a civil penalty, a civil lawsuit, an administrative penalty. Today, the Attorney General cannot bring that action unless invited to do so by the Department of the Environment or Natural Resources, or in some cases, the Department of the Agriculture. I think the Attorney General should have the authority to bring those independent actions.
And speaking of authority, as you've already pointed out, the state's attorney have the major role in crime fighting. And unlike some states, the Maryland Attorney General is not tasked primarily as a prosecutor. What role should the Attorney General and its office play in fighting and reducing crime, particularly in Baltimore?
Sure, and certainly not exclusive to Baltimore, but inclusive of all of our jurisdictions. The Attorney General needs to be a partner. He needs to be a supportive partner with our local states' attorneys, sitting down, working with them as they develop their strategies, working side by side with them in helping them get the resources they need, which means advocating in Annapolis for a budget that will support the important work that they're doing, but also being a partner with the resources that are available to the Attorney General. I mentioned the criminal division. Within the criminal division, the organized crime unit. It focuses on narcotics trafficking. It focuses on gun trafficking. It focuses on labor trafficking, sort of multi-jurisdictional organized crime, including organized retail crime. But today there are only 12 attorneys in that office. If we're going to really support our partners, our state's attorneys, we need to increase the size of the organized crime unit so we can provide a really meaningful backstop to the work that they're doing. At no point do I believe the Attorney General or the state should dictate to local states' attorneys, they're elected locally, on what their strategy should be. Certainly, to the extent that I agree or disagree, I'll have an opportunity as Attorney General with my colleagues in the Office of the Attorney General to influence their decisions as we sit down. But publicly, when the decision is made by a local state's attorney on what their priorities are, what their strategy is, the Attorney General should support that. And that's what I intend to do, to support it as a partner and to provide the resources of my office, not to undermine or circumvent what they do, but to support their crime fighting effort.
And speaking of the local state's attorneys, some have decided not to prosecute low-level crimes. What is your position on that?
You know, I don't want to second guess a state attorney on how they prioritize crime fighting in their jurisdiction. And I don't certainly want to have that debate as a public discussion. I will sit down and share with local states attorneys what I and my experts, the chief of my criminal division, the chief of my criminal appeals division, my investigators, my prosecutors, on what we believe will be most effective in order to reduce crime in a jurisdiction. But at the end of the day, the local state's attorney will make those decisions and announce to the public in whatever way, shape, or form they choose to do that, what their priorities are. Now, personally, I, as Attorney General, personally and professionally, will not announce what crimes we will or will not prosecute. I can tell you that we will start with the most violent crimes first, because with limited resources, I believe that we can make the biggest impact by going after the most violent crimes, the organized, large-scale, complex crimes. But I wouldn't tell you what crimes that I'm not going to enforce. But I think most people understand that neither an attorney general or a state's attorney can enforce and prosecute every crime in a community. The resources aren't there, which really introduces another issue that investigations and prosecution are not the only way that you make neighborhoods safe. You have to invest in opportunities, in education, in healthcare and housing, and reforming the system, as I indicated earlier. All of that is the comprehensive approach to developing, creating, establishing safer neighborhoods in Maryland.
Thank you. During the Hogan years, the Attorney General was given more authority by the General Assembly to pursue lawsuits without asking the governor for permission. Are there any lawsuits or cases that you think Attorney General Frosch should have pursued and didn't, or should not have pursued but did?
The short answer to that is no, and in large part because I've not evaluated the cases that Attorney General Frosch has brought and hasn't brought. I do know that every year, the Office of the Attorney General publishes a report required by the Maryland Defense Act. That was the law that you're referencing. It was passed in 2017, and it was passed in anticipation of a hostile Trump administration. And I say administration, not White House. In administration, whether the EPA, the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, that would put at risk or jeopardy the rights and the interests of Marylanders. And under Brian Frosch's leadership, Maryland either brought or joined many lawsuits against the federal government. We sued the federal government when they tried to roll back environmental protection standards under the EPA. We sued the Department of Labor when they were not enforcing certain labor standards. And under Brian Frosch's leadership, we even sued the Department of Education. You remember when Congress appropriated more dollars during the pandemic for education to support remote learning, to support students and teachers coming back to our schools sooner rather than later. Under Betsy DeVos, then Secretary of Education, they tried to dilute the formula to the disadvantage of Maryland. Brian brought an effective lawsuit to challenge that as well. So it's an annual report. I've had an opportunity to sort of like browse the report. He's been very active, all of it with an intent and eye towards protecting the rights, the interests, and the privileges of Marylanders, from public health to the environment, to opportunity, to education. I think he's been very effective. I hope to step into his shoes and to continue using that authority, even under a Biden administration or any other administration where the federal government is failing Marylanders.
So what is your criteria for filing lawsuits against the federal government, or on the other hand, against national corporations, as also Attorney General Frosch has done?
Right, and I'll take each separately. When it comes to the federal government, it is laid out. The standards are laid out in the Maryland Defense Act. And there are, I think, 8 or 9 broad categories under which the Attorney General can bring an action against the federal government, again, in areas dealing with the environment, with health, with education, public safety. And I'll apply those standards. But in a nutshell, it's when the federal government takes actions that harms the interests, the rights, and the privileges that Marylanders enjoy. And I did highlight, I gave you 3 examples that Brian brought, and those are the types of cases that I will bring and or join along with other attorneys general around the state whose citizens or residents' rights, interests, or privileges may also be jeopardized. In terms of corporations, look, there are a number of divisions and authorities in the Office of the Attorney General that are designed to protect Marylanders, even against the actions, inactions, the conduct or misconduct of corporations. We've got an antitrust division that makes sure that our economy involves free and fair competition. And we're going to be robust and active in antitrust cases. But perhaps the largest division we have and the most active in protecting the interests of Marylanders is the Consumer Protection Division. And we're protecting consumers, whether it's against predatory student lenders, whether it's, a car sales or transaction. It was part of the opioid settlement that came up through the consumer protection. Brian recently settled a case against a a company owned by Jared Kushner of the Trump family, substandard housing, resulted in a $3.5 million settlement on behalf of the residents of those various properties. So there are authorities and statutes that we will use to protect Marylanders against corporations when they do harm to Marylanders.
One of the largest programs that the state has is Medicaid. We spend a lot of money there, and the AG's office has a separate office for prosecution of Medicaid fraud. Are there enough resources there that you've seen over the years to effectively pursue those cases?
There are never enough resources, Len. If I said there were enough resources, then that would undermine my case I'm about to make in January to the General Assembly that I need more resources. But look, they do an effective job. They are recovering. The Medicaid fraud unit are recovering millions of dollars a year back to the taxpayers. Sometimes those investigations uncover actions that are less than fraudulent or criminal, but it's not in compliance with the requirements to bill under Medicaid, and we can recover in those cases as well. But it's important. It's one of the largest programs. It's a joint federal state program providing health coverage for Maryland's neediest residents. So we want to make sure that providers, individual providers, institutional providers are not defrauding Maryland. And when they do, we're going to investigate and we're going to prosecute. When I was the Attorney General, when I was the Lieutenant Governor, then Governor O'Malley asked me to work with the General Assembly to pass the Maryland False Health Claims Act. And that enables us to recover even more money, particularly when we join in actions with the federal government and other states. And just under that act alone, over the last 10 years, we've recovered over $100 million in fraudulent claims submitted by providers in the state of Maryland. So I'm going to be fighting for more resources in most every division and every unit and every bureau. But I can tell you that the men and women who work in that unit and across the Office of the Attorney General, they're doing a fantastic job with the resources that they currently have, but we need more resources.
So in this past year, legislation was proposed that would allow the Attorney General to sue fossil fuel companies for the damage they have done to the environment, much like the way the tobacco companies were pursued. What are your views on that kind of possibility of suing the fossil fuel companies?
Sure, and I know that Anne Arundel County and Annapolis have joined together in filing a suit. Listen, I think that we should use all legal tools available to us to hold corporations accountable, and whether that's fossil fuel companies who are harming our environment, that's our air, it's our water, whether it's ghost gun manufacturers who are selling and sending those parts to Marylanders who are assembling those guns, and in many cases not providing full and accurate information to the purchaser about the risks of those products. So whether it's under environmental protection laws, whether it's under consumer protection laws, I think that we should hold individuals and corporations accountable who do harm to Marylanders, and fossil fuel companies are not immune. I think there are other things that the Attorney General ought to be focusing on as well when it comes to protecting and preserving our environment, addressing climate change and things like environmental justice. And that's testifying in Annapolis. I was in Annapolis this year, not only testifying on ghost guns and resources for women's reproductive health services, but Bryan, as the Attorney General, was in Annapolis testifying in support of the Climate Solutions Now Act. That's Marylanders' best effort this year to address climate change, to incorporate in our environmental compliance laws and environmental justice provision. I think there's more that we can do in that area. So I see the Attorney General not only investigating, prosecuting, bringing claims against those who are doing harm to our environment, putting Marylanders in jeopardy, but also advocating for and supporting policy and legislation that moves us in the right direction when it comes to addressing climate when it comes to protecting our environment and the health of Marylanders.
Another area where the Attorney General has been given some specific authority is in combating human trafficking. Are you familiar with that area, and what more should be done about that? Apparently Maryland, because of being on I-95, has, and lots of airports and transportation facilities, has a lot of issues with human trafficking.
Sure, and I worked with the SAFE Center at the University of Maryland College Park. Sue Esserman, one of the founder, have worked with her, and there are many advocates that are doing great work around the state in bringing greater awareness and resources to the issue of human trafficking. We see human trafficking not only in terms of sex trafficking, but also in labor trafficking, like, for example, on construction work sites. And yes, I am familiar with the fact that the Attorney General now has greater authority to investigate and prosecute that conduct, those offenses. Again, it goes back to that organized crime unit that I mentioned earlier. There are only 12 attorneys, so I'm going to the General Assembly. I want to at least double the size of the organized crime unit so that we can actually carry out the new responsibilities we have to address human trafficking, to combat human trafficking, whether it's in the courts, whether it's partnering with advocates, so that we can protect Marylanders and those who are trafficked through Maryland using that authority. The other piece I would say on human trafficking, a lot of it is education and outreach, right? And educating, whether it's parents, whether it's potential victims of human trafficking, whether it's educators, whether it's employers. I know, for example, in the airline industry, there's an education program for flight attendants to be able to recognize the signs of human trafficking, the kind of behavior that could be suggestive. And you really need good training, because you don't want to stereotype or make poor judgments about a relationship between people and what's actually happening. So as the Attorney General, I also want to make sure that we're incorporating education in the right places, the right programs for the right people, so we can reduce human trafficking by identifying the signs of it at the outset.
On another issue, do you have a position on the use of cash bail and other kinds of ways of using bail or not using bail?
Yeah, let me say this. I think that a few years ago, when Maryland undertook bail reform, I thought that was an important step forward. We should not be detaining people in jail simply because they do not have the resources to make bail. I think that we should use the standards set out in the court rules. Are they a flight risk? Are they a risk to themselves or society? Now, if you look at the numbers in Maryland and the disparities in terms of who's being released on bail and who's not, I think an argument could be made that while we've undergone reform, we haven't seen the results that we were hoping for 4, 5, 6 years ago when we set out on this effort. And some of that is attributable to the lack of education within and among the judiciary, and judges not fully understanding the standard. And so as Attorney General, I want to work with the judiciary to make sure that judges understand the rules that they established and implemented themselves, to make sure that the appropriate assessment is done at each and every bail hearing, that money and the inability to pay is not a reason to keep someone confined or detained, but rather look at some basic factors such as flight risk, the nature of the offense, whether or not that person would do harm to themselves or to others, and the other factors that are laid out. That's what we ought to focus on, and not on someone's resources and income level. We still have far too many people who are waiting in jail because they can't make bail, and we've got to fix that.
Last question, and it's really up to you. Is there anything that I haven't asked about, we haven't talked about, you haven't raised that you would like to bring up with people before you do your, and you'll have a 3-minute closing statement after that.
But I mean, not really. I mean, let me say again, I mean, thank you for the questions. It's a huge office with a lot of responsibility, doing big things on behalf of Maryland. So you couldn't possibly ask me every question that pertains to the office and that might, inform and educate voters. So I appreciate the questions that you did ask, and I'm ready to go into my closing. I don't even know if I need 3 minutes to close.
Well, you don't have to take 3 minutes, but it already went up there.
Great. Well, first of all, let me thank once again the League of Women Voters. I want to thank you, Len. I want to thank the University of Baltimore and all the other sponsors for hosting this forum. I wasn't raised or born into privilege, but I've had the privilege over the course of my entire adult life to serve. First serving in the United States Army on active duty and completing 30 years in uniform service, both as an aviator and a JAG officer, and rising to the rank of full bird colonel. I've had the privilege of serving 8 years in Maryland's General Assembly, 8 years as your lieutenant governor, and most recently completing 6 years in the United States Congress, where some of the most important work I've been able to do is on the Armed Services Committee, making sure that the men and women who serve in the United States military have the training, the resources, the leadership to do their job, a very dangerous job, and to do it effectively and come home safely to their families. So I've had an opportunity to serve in so many capacities, in the legislative capacity and executive capacity. I've been an attorney for 30 years. And most people know me more in my capacity as lieutenant governor when I was a full-time elected public servant, but 30 years involved in class action lawsuits, multi-party litigation, multi-million-dollar settlements, representing parties in environmental law matters, employment law matters, tobacco litigation. Perhaps some of the most rewarding work that I've ever done as an attorney, though, is the pro bono legal services that I was able to provide to my clients, indigent clients who were unable to afford an attorney, whether the matter involved sexual harassment, misdemeanor crimes, or serving children in need of assistance. That has been my most rewarding work. I look forward to serving Maryland as Attorney General. It's an opportunity for me to make a bigger impact in the work that I chose to do 25 years as an elected official and the work that I've been doing my entire life. I moved to Maryland with my family 30 years ago. It's a great state, and I want to be the Attorney General so I can work in partnership with my colleagues in the public sector, with the private sector, the nonprofit sector, to ensure that Maryland is great for every Marylander, that every Marylander residing from Ocean City to Western Maryland, Baltimore, Prince George's, and places in between can enjoy the rights, the benefits, and the privileges of living in Maryland. So I ask each and every one of you for your vote on November 8th. Thank you.
And thank you very much for participating in this YouTube video of the forum. Will be available in a few days at the University of Baltimore Public Affairs channel on YouTube. There will be a forum for 4 of the 5 candidates on the ballot for governor on Thursday. Mail-in voting has already started. Early voting starts on October 27th to November 3rd, and then the election day is November 8th. And I'm sure Congressman Brown is looking forward to that.